when a child is, any child, developing brain, developing nervous system, is extremely susceptible to being uprooted, to being activated, okay? Because you be thinking, sitting there going like, yeah, but where is all this coming from? So when it comes to this lifetime, it could go as far as birth trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, there is a correlation between asthma, allergies, and things like C-section, right? There is a very strong correlation there. There's no question.
Okay.
And so, obviously, that's traumatic. Something like, I know sometimes it can't be avoided, but oftentimes it can be avoided, and people still choose to do it. So this doesn't set up your baby very well for life, because they will start developing all sorts of things, asthma and allergies being in that category of issues. And so, but then we have a growing brain and nervous system, and we have the small child who is not able to communicate very well, not at the beginning anyway. They have certain needs. The child, particularly if it's a more sensitive child, there's going to be all sorts of things that they need. And if their needs are not fully satisfied, which is very, very difficult to do, no matter how good a parent you are, because you're not a mind reader unless you are, and you're responding to every need of your child, then the child will feel like their needs are not being met, equals they're not safe. Because if they're not even getting enough cuddles, enough attention, it's not even about getting enough food and being clothed. It's about meeting all those emotional needs that the child may have, and a lot of them obviously have that. And so then there's all sorts of other things in this child's life that are actually stressful, on top of not necessarily getting all the attention they need. There could actually be stressful, traumatic things. All of these things will cause that activation of this developing nervous system over and over and over again. The brain is now starting to send those signals of, hey, if we are going to survive this, we need to adapt to this. So for instance, if I'm not getting enough attention, maybe if I am a good girl or a good boy or a perfect little girl, then maybe I'll get more affection from my parents or something like that. There could be, control issues. There could be all sorts of things. So we develop these adaptations to survive to those perceived stresses, because the stressor doesn't necessarily need to be real. It just needs to be perceived by the person or by this child. That's a very important thing to realize. It's not about something objective. It's not at all. It's about how we perceive it, how we respond emotionally to it.
Right.
So then, of course, particularly with more sensitive children, you're going to get this constant, they're in fight, flight, or freeze. And then what happens is the system gets wired for fight, flight, or freeze. It starts to respond like that as a default. Because they're not spending enough time feeling safe, like the needs are being met, feeling just calm, relaxed, right? So as we then go through life, then there's going to be more things going on. There's going to be more stresses. And yes, we will adapt and we will survive. But just because we adapt and survive doesn't mean that there's not going to be this constant activation of our fight, flight, or freeze, a survival state. And if that's the case, then over time, because of these connections, the vagus nerve being one of the key ones, you will get the breakdown of the physical body. Again, connection between the brain and most of the organs in the chest and abdominal cavity means that if this nerve doesn't work properly, those organs are not working properly. Also, the vagus nerve not working properly is also connected to cell danger response. There's a connection with that. Okay, so when you've got trauma, obviously cell danger response could be due to biological agents like things in the arm, all of that sort of stuff. Injectables, that's a big one for people, and it's a big source of environmental toxicity that people are willingly signing up for. But obviously, not everybody's aware of what's actually in them. That's one thing, and there's biological agents and infections, things like that. But cell danger response is also driven by trauma. It's also driven by trauma and by being in those chronic emotional states that are very activating to the nervous system, not in a good way, right? So like I said, predominantly things like fear, grief, guilt, shame, anger, right? And so you kind of can see how you training the system to be in those states over and over and over and over. It's gonna, that part of the nervous system is gonna get strong, it's gonna get responsive. Meanwhile, the part of your nervous system that is supposed to take over for 95% of the time is becoming weaker and weaker, less and less responsive. And so I hope that makes sense how this all sort of comes together. So it could be that a child, for instance, is born by C-section, and that's already a strain on the immune system. Then there are more of a sensitive child. Maybe the parents are very kind of people who are not very emotionally connected. They're more emotionally detached. So they're not bad parents. They're making sure that the child has got food, clothes, toys, but they're not available emotionally.
Right.
That child, being more sensitive, is now feeling internally constantly stressed because they're not getting what they need, not fully anyway. And they're feeling more and more like they're on their own in the world. And that's stressful, right? And so then they go to school and maybe there's bullying, maybe there's other things that they're stressed about, maybe they're not performing at school, whatever. And it just winds up and winds up and winds up, and the system becomes more and more dysfunctional and disintegrated. And then they start to develop those different issues. So I hope that makes sense how that all connects together.